All right, hello everyone, welcome. We are going to get started. It is 12 o'clock. If you're just joining us, welcome to the first ever Winter Wonder presented by Boston Harbor Islands National and State Park. If you're from an earlier session, welcome back. I am Rachel Vinson, a biological science technician with the National Park Service on the Boston Harbor Islands. This next presentation is titled Science Together, Researching the Boston Harbor Islands with Community and Citizen Science. Curious how you can help advance scientific research on the Boston Harbor Islands? From your cell phone photography to identifying species, we'll explore community and citizen science efforts to document nature and more on the Boston Harbor Islands. We'll also learn about iNaturalist, a global biodiversity database, and how and why you should get involved with this and other efforts to augment research on the Boston Harbor Islands. I would now like to introduce you to our presenters. Marc Albert is the Director of Natural Resource Partnerships for the National Parks of Boston, which includes the Boston Harbor Islands National and State Park, Boston National Historical Park, and Boston African American National Historic Site. Marc facilitates the study and management of natural areas and cultural landscapes of the parks through partnerships and community engagement. He studied plant ecology at Tufts University and UC Berkeley, and has more than 20 years of experience linking park management to science and community in both San Francisco and Boston. Rebecca Shore is the Cabot Education and Community Engagement Program Manager at the New Stone Living Lab. Her role serves to develop and facilitate learning experiences for Boston Harbor communities, including authentic community science initiatives. Prior to her work at the Stone Living Lab, she coordinated a number of community science programs, including the Save Our Streams program at the Isaac Walton League of America and 2 turtle conservation programs at Mass Audubon's Wellfleet Bay Wildlife Sanctuary. We will save all of your questions until the end of the presentation, but please feel free to type them into the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window as they come to you, or into the chat, or you can raise your hand to be unmuted and ask a question live, again, at the end of the presentation. If you would like closed captions on during the presentation, you can toggle them on and off from the transcript or CC button at the bottom of your Zoom window as well. Without further ado, Marc and Rebecca, welcome to Winter Wonder, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Rachel. And welcome everyone. We're going to spend some time talking about community science and also some opportunities that you can get involved with even starting today to start contributing data and getting involved. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to have a little poll, which I think Rachel or Christina, if you could start that, perfect. And we were just wondering how many of you have heard of community science and or citizen science before today's event. So we're going to give you a little bit of time to fill this out and answer. And one of the things that we're going to talk about is these terms, community science versus citizen science. So you may have heard of one, but not the other. And it looks like we've got about half of folks have voted. So we're going to give you a few more seconds to finish filling this out. All right, looks like we're plateauing here. So we can go ahead and end the poll and then share the results. That's great. So many of you, 80% of you have heard of this term before, and it's also great that some of you haven't, and some of you might not be sure. So one of the things that we would also like to hear about is if you've participated in these projects before, type them out in the chat and share them with us. If you've counted butterflies or you've used iNaturalist, maybe you've used something on Zuniverse, which we'll talk about later. And then you might realize as we're talking about these different projects that you may have participated in one of these projects, but not have realized that what you were doing was actually community science. So if folks can, okay, so I see some answers coming in of what folks have done before. Great that people have used iNaturalist. That's a really popular app there. And then Rachel, do we have any other exciting projects that folks have been involved with? And have you, Rachel, been involved with any community science projects?
Yeah, the one I personally am most familiar with is iNaturalist. I've dabbled in eBird a little bit, but there's a few other here. Bird banding at Carlsbad Caverns, and a few other iNaturalist as well. And feel free to keep inputting them into the chat, and we can keep an eye on that throughout the presentation.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, feel free to keep sharing those because we're always excited to hear about what are some new opportunities that maybe we don't know about. It's a field that's always growing, and it's really exciting to hear about what folks have been involved with. So first off, I want to talk about what is community science. And this might be a term that's a little bit less familiar to folks who may have heard of citizen science. So citizen science or community science is public participation in the collection, interpretation, maybe analysis, and or the use of data, scientific data. The goals of a good community science project are that you collect good science, you produce useful results, and it's an enjoyable and educational experience. So any good project has these three tenets in it to make a really high quality program. Now, the term community science is fairly new, and it's evolved from citizen science because, especially in the United States, citizen can be a loaded term, and we want to make sure that folks feel like anyone can participate in these programs. So as long as you're a member of a community, it doesn't matter if you're a citizen or not, you can participate in these programs. It also emphasizes that we're kind of shifting our mindset in how we design these programs. So historically, in a citizen science project, you might have a researcher who comes up with an idea, wants to research it, recruits volunteers, and they provide information, but they're not so much involved with coming up with the question or designing the project itself. In community science, we're more and more trying to focus on evolving the community from day one to come up with a question, design the protocols, design the project itself, go out and collect data, and then figure out how we're going to use that data. So that's some of the shift that we're starting to focus on, going from just straight, we're going to collect data using citizen scientists, to how can we involve the community in every part of this project. Now, who can be a community scientist? Anyone can. Projects range in complexity. You might have a project like iNaturalist where all you have to do is go out, take a picture of something you're curious about, and then upload it to the app. Or you might have a project like this one here in the picture where you actually have to get trained on how to perform a protocol, maybe identify certain species, and then report out data. So anyone can participate in these projects, and there's a whole range of involvement if you want to get really involved and really get trained up on something, or you want to be involved more casually and contribute without having to invest as much time as you might in another project. Next slide, please. So what kind of data can be collected in a citizen science project or a community science project? All kinds of data. Basically, anything that you can think of can involve community science. And something I do want to note, you just heard me use citizen science and community science kind of interchangeably. The community science terminology is pretty new. So that's something you might hear Mark and I going back and forth with those terms. And that's just because it's something we're getting used to too. So bear in mind, we might swap back and forth between those two different words. However, you can use community science to collect all kinds of information on all kinds of projects. So you can use it from anything from biodiversity, weather, water quality, galaxy formations. You can even use community scientists to transcribe historical texts. So some libraries are actually utilizing scientists to read scanned images of old texts and transcribe them so we can get access to resources that for hundreds of years we didn't have access to. And there's a really cool one that is a favorite of mine that's about identifying manatee calls. So you might not realize manatees actually chat with each other. So that's a really fun one to do, and you can do it from home, from your computer. So the real advantage of community science as well is that it gives us access to a lot more data than we might be able to get if we only used, say, trained staff or trained biologists. So you can mobilize a whole community to go out and collect lots of data that's really good quality and gives you a lot more information more quickly. And you can also get it maybe for a longer period of time. You're not limited by the fact that you might have a seasonal staff person, or that you might have someone who moves and you have to hire someone else. You have this nice core of volunteers and community scientists who continue to collect that data. And recent studies have shown something that a lot of program managers already knew, which is that community scientists collect just as high quality data as these staff members. So it's really valuable and really usable data, which is really great. The last thing is that because you can utilize community members, They're embedded in the community, they're on the ground, and they can be kind of the watchdogs for their own environment. So if you have a staff person who only goes out once a year to sample a site, if you utilize community scientists, they can be out there, they can be there every day, every month. Maybe they just go casually out, go out and walk, and they might notice a problem or a change a lot more quickly than a scientist, a trained scientist might. So it's a really great way to keep an eye on things and really encourage folks to be stewards of their own environment and keep us informed of changes that are happening really quickly. Next slide. So a key part of a good community science project is that the data needs to be used. We don't just want to have folks go out and collect data and then just have it sit on a computer or sit in a file and not be used. It's really important that this data is utilized by professionals, by the community, and there's lots of different ways it can be used. You can use it to educate your friends and neighbors, educate each other. You can use it for advocacy efforts, for making change with policymakers. You can also use it to identify areas that might need further investigation and further research. So by investigating a certain question, it might spark further questions. We want to make sure that all this data is provided, that everyone has access to it and everyone can use that data to ask more questions. A great example of how community science data can be used is the Wicked Hot Boston project, which the Museum of Science did, where they coordinated multiple community scientists to go out and measure the temperature in the city of Boston on record hot days. And they did this to be able to identify areas that are called heat islands. These are areas that are much hotter than other areas of the city. So for example, an area that has a lot of trees and a lot of greenery is actually significantly cooler than areas that might have a lot of parking lots or a lot of industry. By collecting this information, they can then provide to the city, and the city can utilize this data to target areas, say, for planting more trees or creating infrastructure, things like splash pads, so that way folks can go and cool off if they need to. So this data is really usable, really important, and can be continued to used over time. So it's not just a one and done feature, but this data that they collected, they can compare it 5 years from now, 10 years from now. It's a really great opportunity to involve the community in their own research and then in advocating for their own change. Next slide, please. So how are projects designed and created? And this reflects a little bit of the evolution from citizen science to community science. Now, most of the projects that are designed still are much more like the model on the left, which is sort of the classic citizen science project, where you'd have a researcher come up with a question and then go out and into the community to seek community scientists to collect information and report that data back. So it's a very top-down approach. You'll have someone who comes up with the question, provides the protocol, provides the resources, they train members of the community provides that data back, and then hopefully the researcher still provides information and results back to the community, but it's pretty top-down. They're feeding that information up, but they're not involved in the questions themselves, the design, things like that. The model on the right is much more the community science model, and we're working to have more and more of our projects be like the model on the right, where the community itself is involved with coming up with the questions, designing the protocol, using the data, and then using that information to spark even more questions. So it's much more circular and much more of a natural evolution rather than that top-down model. Now, a key role in community science initiatives is that you need partners, and these partners can provide resources, like nonprofits can provide access to other communities. You can have parks partners who provide you access to sites. And so an example of a new partnership that's been created is the Stone Living Lab. Perfect. So the Stone Living Lab, which I work for, as Rachel introduced, is a brand new initiative where we are building this kind of partnership to enhance community science efforts around climate change and climate resiliency in Boston Harbor and the islands. So you can see all of our partners across the top, which involves researchers, access to parks, access to programs, things like that. And the vision of the Stone Living Lab is to create a future where people work with nature to make coastal regions resilient and adaptive to climate change while enhancing natural and built environments. And so through our mission, we're hoping to research and innovate solutions to climate change, utilizing the harbor itself and the islands, and also do this in an equitable and environmentally just way. So we have these 4 guiding principles for our mission: research, climate preparedness, education, and policy. And our community science efforts fall right in line with that climate preparedness and education aspect. So in climate preparedness, we want to make sure we promote equitable and creative, flexible coastal adaptation programs. And in our education program, we want to engage our communities in education and outreach to promote that innovation and be able to facilitate research utilizing the community. Our vision is also to become a real hub for Boston Harbor coastal resilience science and education efforts, bringing together all different players from around the city, coming together and being able to utilize our knowledge and our connections to really help promote and protect and be able to utilize our city even as climate change continues on. We'll also be able to use this opportunity to work with different youth groups, different community groups, design community science projects that answer questions that communities themselves have, and really be able to kind of engage the whole city, the whole harbor in this effort. So to hear more about some of the specific opportunities that you can get involved with now, I'm going to hand things over to Marc, and he's going to talk about some community science projects that he's been involved with.
Thanks, Rebecca. As you just said, I'm going to walk folks through a snapshot of some of the community science projects that are happening in and around Boston Harbor that folks can get involved with. Overall, the focus of community science here is about sort of tracking changes in a changing world, just like Rebecca was saying. And there's sort of 2 main threads of that. One is tracking coastal change. We're in Boston Harbor, obviously, is a coastal area, and we know that storms and coastal change along the coastline are a huge concern for residents, for businesses, and of course for park managers of the Boston Harbor Islands. The other main thread is documenting changing biodiversity. So first, to talk about coastal change, one easy way for folks to participate is by simply snapping photos of either very high tides and just sort of normal high tide flooding, not storms, or damage and impacts from storms. And the Massachusetts Office of Coastal Zone Management is part of a national sort of effort to facilitate this through what's called My Coast. And it's really easy to sign up and just take photos of whatever your nearest coastal area is on what are called king tides, which are the very highest tides of the year. Not every high tide is the same. And when the moon and the sun are lined up, the tides are extra high, and that's what the King Tides project is about. The Storm Reporter is just like it sounds like, an opportunity to document coastal damage. A project that is very hot off the press, literally just sort of taking shape this week, and we just had a conversation about this yesterday, is through the Stone Living Lab, where folks at the UMass Boston School for the Environment are going to be working with sort of local community partners to do what's called beach profiling, which is get a kit and have 2 sticks and find a common location that you can go back to over time, and then simply you measure out the distance from a straight line to the surface of the sand or the bluff. And then you can track over time how much erosion is happening or how much the beach is adding sediments. And the idea is to do this monthly at several beaches across the Boston Harbor region, and then also right before and right after big storms. So, for example, there's this nor'easter coming in Monday night. When this is up and running, we would hope to find partners in these local areas that would be interested to go out on Monday afternoon and do a profile, and then go back on Tuesday or Wednesday and see how much difference was there. And also they will take photographs to sort of qualitatively assess that change. Moving to the biodiversity, the central platform that has emerged for sort of easy participation in documenting biodiversity is iNaturalist. And the goals of documenting biodiversity everywhere really are twofold. One is to create a rolling inventory of what species live around us. that both is helpful for protecting and managing the species and the habitats, and also for providing enjoyment for people to have lists of birds that are around, lists of plants, lists of fungi, et cetera. The other goal of doing this on an ongoing basis is that as we gain more observations over time, we can start tracking changes. Just like coastal change is sort of speeding up due to climate change, species are shifting their ranges according, with the warming climate in the water, on the shore, and in the uplands. And having a lot of data from a lot of folks helps us track how these species shifts are progressing over time. And again, helps us figure out how we can protect the biodiversity. iNaturalist is super easy. I know several of you have probably already used it. You simply, most people do it via a smartphone app. You can use a regular camera and upload through a computer. But you take photos and post them as observations, and then you or others can help to identify those things. It's sort of a community of amateur scientists helping to identify each other's observations and build this global database. Once an observation has been sort of vouched for by more than 2 people, it becomes research grade, so-called, and goes into the global biodiversity information database called GBIF. So it contributes to international research. And it is amazing how much this has taken off in the last decade. This is a snapshot taken yesterday on the iNaturalist website of all the observations in the Boston area. The different colors indicate different types of species, like birds are one color, fungi, insects, plants, etc. And you could just see how well represented our sort of the biodiversity in our area is, but there's still some gaps. And as I said, we want more. One of the things that's kind of amazing about iNaturalist is that it does connect people anywhere and helps us figure things out. That image, the observation that's identified there from one of the Boston Harbor Islands, I happened to be there in December when Allie Putnam and I found this, and she posted it. And it was kind of a crazy blob sitting on the rocks at low tide, out on one of these outer harbor islands. And she posted it, and she's a marine biologist, had a good guess as to what it might be, but this is how she learned along the way, because a second user tagged to a third and fourth user who they thought would be good at identifying this kind of thing. The third user had a suggestion, and then posted another observation to compare it with. Then a fourth user suggested at least a superfamily, like the group that it's in. And then Allie, the original poster, went back in and sort of confirmed some of the morphological details. And then finally, her final comment at this point anyway is, upon further investigation, I think your ID is correct. And so this is now, she's gotten to the ID through, talking to people that she would have had no way to contact in advance. Also, our very own Rachel Vincent, a couple years ago, took an image of an egg case of an insect out on Lovell's Island that caught the eye of an entomologist in California, who noted that it might be from an agricultural pest that would be potentially an issue or a concern if it were here in Massachusetts. And that led to a camping trip of a couple entomologists out on Lovell's Island in 2019 to try to find it. So it's kind of amazing how these things work. iNaturalist also can be used to sort of organize efforts into projects. Some projects are very large, such as on the centennial anniversary of the national park system in 2016, there was a year-long all national parks iNaturalist based BioBlitz. And you can see on the left there were almost 135,000 observations taken as part of that effort. We also have used it here for much smaller, more constrained projects, such as the incoming freshman class of UMass Boston participated in a BioBlitz that we facilitated in 2018 over a couple days in early September. And there were, as you can see, 157 species from 663 observations. We also use it to sort of gather all the information as part of our inventories. That the example there on the right is for all fungi observations within the Boston Harbor Islands. And you can see at this point, there's 221 species that have been identified. We are lucky to be working with a couple excellent mycologists to help with the IDs there, because it can be tricky. But that's the kind of project where anyone who submits an observation of any fungi, any mushroom, it gets automatically pulled into this project just by the sort of algorithms within iNaturalist. So the users don't have to know that they're contributing to this, but they automatically do. The biggest international project that uses iNaturalist is coming up again in late April and early May, and any of you can participate in it. It's called the City Nature Challenge, and it's kind of an informal, friendly competition that started 5 or so years ago between San Francisco and Los Angeles, and is now spread to more than 150 cities around the world, where and Boston has been very active the last few years in particular. And any observations taken during this time period, and then the IDs of them, are sort of part of the Boston effort. So we've done very well. We've been about top 10 in the number of participants each of the last couple years. Even though last year we weren't really able to get groups together and go out to the park or to have sort of events around this, the sort of folks who are working on the Boston effort really promoted the idea of people getting out in their neighborhoods and local parks, their yards, etc. And we hope we will be doing that again this year. So I hope you'll join. One of the sort of specific projects that emerged out of the City Nature Challenge, and we've now sort of given it life of its own, is something we call the Bivalve Quest. We're working with Dr. Carolina Bastidas from MIT Sea Grant. We are working to identify all of the bivalves. So these are mussels and clams and scallops and oysters along the coastline all around Boston Harbor and on the Boston Harbor Islands. The initial idea was to figure out how many European oysters versus native Eastern oysters were around. We've sort of expanded it because once you're in those habitats and looking, it's kind of easy to look for all the stuff at the same time. This is another project where you just really need a way to mark out like a 5 by 1 meter plot. You don't really need any particular tools, and you can collect the data on a smartphone or a computer. Another project that's in the water is another effort through Mass CZM called MIMIC, which stands for the Marine Invasive Monitoring and Information Collaborative, but we just all call it MIMIC. It's basically an effort to track about 20 invasive marine species, a lot of which are really weird looking and wild and kind of amazing once you get your head in the water. And they tend to accumulate on docks that stay underwater all the time, or on ropes, or in any surface that is underwater almost all the time. And so CZM coordinates this from southern Maine through Rhode Island, and we've been collecting data in the Harbor Islands for about 10 years. Another fairly easy thing to pick up on. Probably the easiest way to get involved, and maybe the most addictive, especially in this time of sort of being at home a lot, is the Mystic River Watershed Association's herring counts, where you literally just have to go onto their website and click, I want to count, or start counting, and then it shows you a 30-second video, and you simply see how many fish pass by. I don't know if you can see my cursor, there's a fish on the left side of that image there. And on this particular 30-second video, there were 2 fish. So you just enter the number 2, and then you have an opportunity to do it again and get a new random 30-second video. And that is an excellent project that involves a lot of folks. And by having multiple people view the same video, that it's sort of a way to control for the quality of scientific data. And they, as you can see, they've yielded almost 370,000 herring in last year's effort. So that's a kind of an addictive and fun one to participate in. All those projects are really easy, sort of low commitment. You can take one observation and you've helped. There are a couple projects that take a little more commitment and training. In in the park, specifically the Boston Harbor Islands. One of them is coastal breeding bird monitoring, where folks go out with a professional bird scientist on and sort of a winding route through the Harbor Islands and collect observations of nesting activity from about a dozen species of coastal breeding birds. And we also work with volunteers to collect data on the changing vegetation, changing plant species composition in areas where we're doing habitat restoration work. One thing I wanted to just step back and note is that for sure, the history of community science and citizen science sort of relies on volunteers who have the opportunity to participate. You know, most projects still are, if you have time, if you have the way to transport yourself, if you're comfortable in a natural environment, then we'd love to have you. And that's great. But there's really an issue and a challenge with the sort of equity and inclusion aspect. And you know, we who are hoping to be champions of this effort are trying to build in ways to involve communities in, like Rebecca said, in helping develop the questions that are relevant to them in their neighborhoods, and try to find ways for them to be involved. This issue of equity and inclusiveness and sort of diversity in the field is true in the citizen science realm, and also just generally true in marine science. So we have a lot to learn and a long way to go. But we through the Stone Living Lab partnership here and through broader efforts like the Citizen Science Association are hoping to make some progress on that. And now I'm going to pass it back to you, Rebecca, to talk about even more ways to get involved.
Great. All right, so we just want to talk about a couple platforms that you can use right now from your computer at home to get involved with projects. You can get involved with projects that take you outside, or projects like the herring count that you can do from the comfort of your own home, especially when it is in the teens outside. So the first one is Scistarter. Scistarter is a great database for projects, both locally, nationally, and even internationally. So you can go to scistarter.org and search for projects by keyword, by topic, by geography, and they'll have projects that include, ones that are hosted at local libraries, or projects that are similar to the herring count. They have a project called Stall Watcher, which is involved with Alzheimer's research. So it's a great way to get involved and sort of dip your toe into the water of citizen science and community science and see what's out there. The next platform is one called Zuniverse. So in the next slide, we have Zuniverse, which utilizes that crowdsourcing capability really, really widely. So this is the place that has projects like galaxy formation identification. The manatee call one is on there. And then, for example, this project with elephants, where you might have a project that collects thousands and thousands of images or audio files, and they rely on the crowd to be able to view a snapshot, watch a video, listen to an audio clip and say, yes, there's an elephant in this image, or I can hear a whale calling in this audio clip. So this is a great one. You dive right in. So there's no training required that you have to attend a class or anything. You can just dive in and start working with real data right away. And they found some really powerful stuff. I was talking to someone who shared the story about a school teacher in Denmark, I believe, who actually discovered a new celestial body, and now it's been named after her because she was looking at these different images of galaxies, noticed a pattern, reached out to the researchers, and they said, we've never noticed this before. So this is a great way to dive in right away with some data, and also play around, have some fun with different projects that are all across the world. And then finally, with the Stone Living Lab, our goal is to become this kind of hub for the Boston Harbor area. So you can visit our website, stonelivinglab.org. It's still under construction right now, so there's not a ton of information, but one thing you can do is sign up for our email list. And so as projects start coming online, including this beach profiling project that Marc talked about, you will be able to be informed about them, get involved, and even share some ideas of what you might have, what are concerns you might have as a community member that you might want to see investigated by us, by some of our researchers, or by you, our community scientists. And we'll also drop in the chat a form to sign up for information about that beach profiling project. So keep an eye out for that link, fill it out, and we'll send along some information. So with that, I think we're wrapped up. And so we have time for some Q&A. I saw a couple of questions coming through. If you have any questions about community science in general, specific ways you can get involved right now, feel free to send those in and we'll spend some time to chat.
Thank you so much, Mark and Rebecca. That was such a great presentation. I know I definitely learned a lot. So there was a question in the chat from Ed asking about kind of the focus area of the Boston Harbor and specifically in the Stone Living Lab. So, you know, what are the outer reaches of that? Is Rumney Marsh included? And kind of like what are those reaches in the north and south and inland of Boston that are included in that focus area?
I'll take a stab at that, and Rebecca, please share what you want. The Stone Living Lab partnership is really just a little bit more than a year old, so we don't have all of the, you know, we don't have a perfect answer to that. But I'd say that the Boston Harbor watershed is sort of the overall catchment. The purpose of the sort of partnership, as Rebecca said, is to facilitate coastal resilience, science, and education. And if that, so certainly Rumney Marsh is sort of within that region, and we are interested to both do to test specific coastal resilience solutions in Boston Harbor and on the islands, and then study involve the community in studying those and sort of figure out ways to help with help protect the Boston area from future storm damage. And that's from salt marshes to built environment to coastal bluffs and beaches, you know, the whole range. So yes, Rumney Marsh is sort of in the area, and we are trying to build build upon an already existing amazing network of folks in the Boston Harbor area, to sort of play our role as a connector and a clearinghouse, focused specifically on coastal resilience solutions that used sort of nature-based or so-called hybrid methods.
Yeah, and the three of the biggest threats from climate change to the city, which I'm sure many of you folks are familiar with and have probably experienced on some level: sea level rise, heat issues, and then stormwater damage. So especially on the coast, where Boston is particularly very vulnerable. I think we might be the 8th most vulnerable city in the world, I believe, to sea level rise. So a lot of Boston, you know, is right up on the shoreline and was even artificially built into and expanded into the harbor itself. And so that's one of our major concerns, is being able to adapt our coastline to be able to make sure we can still use it, live in it, play in it, while also responding to the sea level change and the storms that are certainly going to affect us years down the road.
Awesome, thanks so much. There's a few questions about the orange blob, and was there a final answer on that, or is it still kind of being finalized in discussion, Mark?
Yes, it was a type of nudibranch. I would have to go back in my slides to see the species, because that's certainly not my area of expertise. But yes, both the Allie, who is the UMass Amherst PhD candidate, she agreed with one of the other folks. It's a type of nudibranch. Go on iNaturalist and go to that sort of outer island cluster, and you can find it and learn from that observation.
Awesome, thank you. There's been a few questions about any projects for 2021, that people can directly get involved in, either individually or in groups, or if it's, you know, all of these things. Is there any current specific goals for 2021, or is that kind of still getting worked on?
Yeah, so certainly that beach profiling project, which Mark talked about, and I'm just tracking down the link for the form, which you can fill out if you're interested in getting involved with that. So again, the goal of beach profiling, the goal of it is to basically be able to track changes on the beaches over time, especially before and after storms. So we've certainly, if you've ever been out on a beach during a storm, you've seen that there are these really dramatic waves come on and they make really dramatic changes to the shoreline. And so something we want to look at is actually how are storms affecting both the islands and the harbor beaches? Do the islands protect us? We definitely think that the islands perform a really valuable service by breaking some of those waves and making sure us on the coast aren't as affected. So that's our main one that we're going to be rolling out. We do have some ideas for being able to get folks outside, especially as the spring and the summer ramps up. Of course, a lot of this is going to be dependent, as we all know, on how safely we can get, folks maybe in groups out to the islands, but we really want to come up with some projects to be able to allow people to get out on their own, get outside, collect some data. So there certainly are some things in the works. And if you sign up for our email list, we will be sure to keep you informed as they come to fruition.
Awesome. There's another question, excuse me, about, they said, I know on iNaturalist, there's a feature where anyone can create their own project. Do you have any experience or examples of this within the park? And is this a feature in other programs or things that we have worked on as a whole in this area?
Rachel, you actually would probably be the best person on this call to answer that, because you're our iNaturalist project sort of lead, as you know, of course. But the short answer is yes. We've created several projects specifically at Boston Harbor Islands National and State Park. We're currently working on sort of bundling those so that you can go to the Boston Harbor Islands sort of iNaturalist home. There'll be sort of I don't know what the proper term is, but like a sort of, like within iNaturalist, you can go to the site at Boston Harbor Islands, and then all of the projects that we are part of would be listed under that. And Rachel, please explain that more clearly if I'm not explaining it clearly. But it includes this ongoing inventory of fungi in the park specifically. And there are other projects that aren't only about the park, but that we have contributed a lot of data to that have their own iNaturalist project page as well, such as that Mimic Marine Invasives project. So that you can look up Mimic on iNaturalist, and there's a project for that. And that's a great way to sort of just browse what you're looking for, see how, different species sometimes are different colors or have different textures. It's a great way to sort of learn what you're looking for. So there's a huge range of projects on iNaturalist, and you can search by geography for that. And so, Rachel, I don't know if you have any more to add to that answer.
No, I think that really covers it. You can create your own projects, and it really has to do with, you can set them up as different ways of collections, either within an area, within a time frame, within certain species, taxa groups, things like that. And as Marc was saying, we have utilized this. That is how we have set up a lot of projects over the last few years in iNaturalist. So thanks for the question. I had a couple questions as well. One basically being, how do you quantify success in community science, and both success on the community involvement side of it and on the science part of it? Is there any, what are those metrics, and how might you quantify that?
I'd love to say a couple of things on that, and love to hear what you have to say, Rebecca. We are really working on that. We in Boston have an amazing academic universe here. And we've been working with UMass Boston folks in particular to try to, and Colleen Hitchcock at Brandeis, who was originally going to, be giving this presentation, to develop a rubric for identifying the specific indicators of success in 3 different categories. Is it good science? Does it provide relevant information? And is it an enjoyable or an educational experience? So what Colleen and her student are working on right now is breaking each of those 3 general categories into very specific quantifiable measures. We've tested this out a bit working with the Honors College incoming freshman class. We've done that, facilitated BioBlitz 3 times, and working with Dr. Rob Stevenson at UMass Boston. We've set up a survey for the students before and after their experience, asking them things like, are you familiar with citizen science, before, and then asking them after questions such as, did you find this enjoyable? Did you learn anything? Do you think you contributed to the park's knowledge, things like that, just to get a sense of that third category. Was it valuable for the participants? So we are working very hard on exactly that, trying to quantify the outcomes, and hopefully, working with academic partners to publish those data, and so that the community, the field of community science can sort of improve across the board.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think that's something that as community science as a field has grown and become more formalized. I mean, people have been doing community science for hundreds of years, but now that it's is it successful? And certainly there are more traditional ways of saying, did you get published paper out of this? Another key feature is, do people keep participating? Do they keep coming back? Tracking the number of people who are involved and making sure that they themselves feel like they're contributing. So it's a combination of sort of some of those sociology questions, as hard science questions, but exactly as Marc said, that's something that we're working on right now.
Awesome. Another question, kind of going back to the beginning of the presentation, Rebecca, you had a slide about a kind of circular way of doing community science. So getting questions from the community that the community can help answer, and that researchers can kind of help evaluate. So how would you communicate with the community? How would you get those questions? Where would that process be? How would you reach out to the public about that?
That's such a good question. And that is what we're doing right now, is asking those questions and trying to find those people, because something that can happen very easily is you kind of get stuck in an echo chamber of, who and you're going to reach out to people, and so I could very easily just talk to people in the Park Service or people at DCR and think, oh yeah, I talked to 15 people, I should have a pretty good idea. But a really big focus is reaching out to community groups that might not be right on the top of your mind of who you would reach out to. So faith groups are a really great resource. They're embedded in the community. They're really involved and really care about being stewards of their neighborhoods. You can reach out to different kinds of youth groups, boys and girls clubs. There's all different, being creative about who you reach out to is really important. And then being able to, you don't want to show up to a community and say, climate change is happening, like, what do you want to know about it? Being able to bring some ideas of having sort of a tool belt of tools that you can use or expertise that you can offer. You really want to be able to come and offer, hey, we've got a climate scientist who knows how to interpret data, but we really want to know, what are you concerned about? And a key thing too for a lot of communities is being able to discuss with them things that it might not even connect in your mind are climate change related. So for example, my T-stop keeps being closed because of flooding during storms. That's a climate change problem, because there's worse storms, there's more precipitation, it's flooding transportation areas, and now you can't get to where you need to go. So it's really about thinking very creatively, and also it's a balance of working with the community to make sure they're aware of what's going on, how it connects to climate change, and then bringing to them opportunities to say, what are some questions that you might have, and here's some ways that we can maybe investigate them together. So these are kind of the hard-hitting questions, especially with community science. There's a lot more of a important focus on this. You can't just say, oh, I'm going to ask the same 3 people who volunteer already. You need to really be proactive. That's a really key part of it, is spending some real effort, not just falling back on maybe the same people you would engage with before.
Awesome. And a question about this weekend's nor'easter. Do we, I don't know if you two know much more about it, but are we expecting flooding? Is this a good opportunity to use some of those tide and weather-based apps that Marc talked about at the beginning? What are we expecting for this weekend, and how might the community be able to share their information and what they see?
That's a great question, really well timed. The full moon was, I think, 2 nights ago, I believe. So that would have been, so the highest tides of this month would be, a couple days ago to maybe tomorrow. So it won't be the very highest tides on Monday night of the month. But given the timing of the storm, or depending upon the timing of the storm and the location of the position of the coast, areas that face east and northeast are most likely to be flooded by storm surge winds, in nor'easters like this. So the short answer is yes, there should be some flooding. How bad it's predicted to be, I actually haven't really looked specifically at that, but there are good flood prediction maps for that. And absolutely, folks should go to My Coast, look up My Coast, and get the app. It's very simple to register and go down to the shore and take pictures. That's how we all help each other learn.
Yeah, and a key part of something Marc just mentioned about, the models of what we think might happen. A really key part of community science is being able to actually report on what really happened. We have these weather models, we have predictions about precipitation, but it can range even over the city of Boston. Some areas get more rain than others. And by going out and reporting what's actually happened, you can help enhance these models that cities, that scientists are working out and say, you predicted that it wasn't going to flood very bad right here, but I'm looking at it right now and it's pretty bad. So that's another key part, is that it's a feedback loop of improving the science to improve what scientists can share out, and then just keeps going like that. So it's a really key part.
Awesome. And that question is a really great ender for this. And it's a really great time to plug a presentation tomorrow during the Winter Wonder actually about nor'easters. So there will be a presentation at 11 a.m. called Interpreting Nor'easters, Illustrating Coastal Change and Storm Response. And that will be during tomorrow's Winter Wonder session. So please feel free to jump back tomorrow. But in the meantime, during today, we still have plenty more sessions going on this afternoon. Thank you, Rebecca and Marc, for such a wonderful presentation. And thank you all for joining and attending and asking some really great questions. We will now be taking a lunch break from 1 to 2 p.m., but the webinar session itself will remain open. If you want to stay, discuss things in the chat box, you're more than welcome to do that. We do hope that you'll join us again for this afternoon. The first session of the afternoon will be with Dr. No. It'll be Tracks in the Snow, an Introduction to Animal Sign. That will be starting at 2 o'clock. For a full schedule, you can check out the Eventbrite or Facebook pages, and the links will be posted in the chat in just a moment. So I do hope that you'll join us for the remainder of this afternoon's schedules, as well as tomorrow, and get a little more information about the nor'easter that's coming our way. Have a wonderful lunch break, and we hope to see you this afternoon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.